The first thing Ambassador Yael Doran noticed about the Veilhari court was the silence. Not the comfortable silence of empty rooms or late nights. This was the deliberate engineered quiet of a civilization that had learned to use silence as a weapon. The Veilhari High Court of the Sovereign Reaches occupied a structure that human architects had privately described as geometrically hostile. 11 angular towers converged at a central chamber with no visible supports, no natural light, and a gravity field calibrated 0.3 points above standard, just enough to make every human breath feel slightly more expensive than it should. Yael had been briefed on this. She breathed anyway. She had served 14 years in diplomatic corps before this assignment, 3 postings in active conflict zones, 2 first contact scenarios that had nearly ended with weapons fire, and 1 negotiation on Kareth Station that still occasionally appeared in her nightmares. She was not easily intimidated. But the Veilhari were patient in ways that made her nervous. Their stillness wasn't the stillness of waiting. It was the stillness of already knowing how something would end. The summit had been ongoing for 11 days. The official agenda concerned border rights along the Kashan Corridor, a thin strip of navigable space between human expansion and Veilhari sovereign territory that both sides needed and neither was willing to share honestly. The real agenda, as it always was in negotiations of this scale, concerned fear. The Veilhari feared what humanity had become in 400 years of spaceflight. Humanity feared what the Veilhari had always been, ancient, organized, and quietly furious about the intrusion. Yael sat at the long obsidian table across from 3 Veilhari court advisors and one figure she had not been expecting, the Queen's daughter. Her name, rendered in the closest human phonetic approximation, was Sailvori. She was young by Veilhari standards, perhaps 2 centuries old, with the pale gray skin and slow, deliberate eye movements characteristic of the royal lineage. She had no formal role in the negotiations. Her presence had never been explained. She sat at the far corner of the table like a piece of furniture that had decided to watch. But on the 3rd day she had spoken to Yael directly. Not through the translation matrix, in halting, clearly self-taught standard human, her consonants slightly too precise, her pauses too long. She had asked Yael what rain felt like. Yael had told her. By the 7th day, Sailvori was sitting closer. By the 9th, she had begun asking questions after the formal sessions ended, about Earth, about the colony worlds, about what humans meant when they described something as beautiful. Yael had answered honestly, carefully, aware that every word was being observed. Aware that the attention of a royal was never accidental. On the 11th day, as Yael rose to leave the chamber at the close of session, Sailvori stood as well, and placed her hand on Yael's wrist. It was not aggressive. It was not political. It was the gesture of someone very young and very isolated who had found something they recognized as genuine and did not want to release it. The chamber went absolutely still. The 3 court advisors moved with a precision that suggested the motion was rehearsed. The senior advisor, a broad-shouldered Veilhari named Vel Kareth, whose title roughly translated as Keeper of Court Coherence, crossed the room in 4 steps and spoke in low, rapid Veilhari. The translation matrix rendered it a half-second later. The royal blood is not to have contact with the outer representative. This is violation of the 3rd protocol of separation. Sailvori did not release Yael's wrist. Yael did not move. She understood, in the precise way that 14 years of high-stakes diplomacy had calibrated her understanding, that the next 30 seconds would determine the shape of everything that followed. The court advisors were not simply enforcing protocol. They were establishing a claim that contact between the royal line and a human representative was a transgression that required correction. That Yael was, in some procedural sense, in possession of something that did not belong to her. The framing mattered. It always did. If Yael pulled away, she confirmed the framing. She was an intruder who had caused an incident. The negotiations would be suspended pending review. The Kashan corridor would remain contested, and the political window, already narrow, would close. If she stayed still, she was defying the court openly, which carried its own set of consequences. She chose a 3rd option. She turned to face Vel Kareth directly, keeping her arm relaxed, and said, in standard human, knowing the matrix would translate, I believe the royal is conducting an informal exchange of cultural information, which falls under Article 7 of the summit protocols both parties agreed to before arrival. I would be grateful if the court could clarify which specific subclause of the 3rd protocol applies here, so we can address any concern precisely. The silence that followed lasted 4 full seconds. Among humans, for seconds of silence in a formal setting is mildly awkward. Among the Veilhari, for seconds of silence from a senior court official was the equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. Sailvori released Yael's wrist. Slowly. Deliberately. And then in that precisely accented standard human she said, "Tomorrow. Same time." She walked out of the chamber without looking back. Vel Kareth watched Yael for a long moment. The translation matrix didn't catch what he said next. It was too quiet and directed away, but the human linguistics officer reviewing the session recording later would spend 3 weeks trying to render it accurately. The best approximation they arrived at was, "This one is more trouble than the fleet report suggested." Yael filed her report that evening from her quarters aboard the human diplomatic vessel Perseverance, docked at the station's outer ring. She kept the summary precise and clinical as she had been trained. Unofficial contact with Royal Minor. Court response. Resolution via protocol citation. Recommend continuation of negotiations without escalation. She did not include the part where her hands were shaking after she left the chamber. She did not include the part where she had sat in the corridor outside the session room for 6 minutes before she was steady enough to walk normally. She did not include what she had seen in Sailvori's eyes when the young royal had held her wrist. Not desperation, not manipulation, not the calculated gesture of a political actor. Just the plain, unglamorous, cross-species recognition of someone who was very lonely and had found another person worth holding onto for a moment. Yael was a diplomat. She dealt in abstractions, borders, rights, protocols, leverage. She was trained to keep the personal out of the political. But she had learned, through 14 years and too many close calls, that the personal was never really out of anything. It was always there, underneath the formal language, doing the actual work. She transmitted the report. Then she opened the cultural briefing files on Veilhari court structure she had been meaning to read for 3 days, and started from the beginning. Because whatever Vel Kareth had meant by his quiet remark about the fleet reports, she intended to understand it before tomorrow's session. The Veilhari court had made a move tonight. She just hadn't identified it yet. Commander Elias Tavros had been watching the Veilhari sensor signatures for 9 hours when the third ship moved. He was the senior tactical officer aboard Perseverance, a man who had spent 11 years reading the behavioral patterns of spacecraft the way ornithologists read birds, by their movement, their spacing, their relationship to what surrounded them. He had catalogued Veilhari vessel behavior in 4 previous encounters. He knew their standard formations. He knew their patrol intervals. He knew that when a Veilhari warship altered its bearing by more than 4 degrees without a corresponding logged flight plan, it was not navigational adjustment. It was positioning. The first ship, a mid-tonnage Veilhari military escort class, designated Vichas Keth Aner in human fleet records, had changed bearing at 0214 station time. 2 degrees starboard, slight elevation adjustment, engine output unchanged. Small enough to attribute to routine. Tavros had flagged it anyway. The second ship moved at 0331. 4 degrees. Same elevation pattern. Different vessel, Vichas Meryl Soren, which human analysts classified as a dedicated fire support platform. The kind that didn't travel alone. At 0519 the third moved. Vias Thrain, an escort carrier, repositioned from its standard holding pattern near the outer corridor buoys to a position that, Tavros ran the calculation 3 times because he wanted to be wrong, placed it at the apex of a triangle with the other 2 ships. A triangle with Perseverance near the geometric center. He sent the data to Fleet Captain Mira Osei and Ambassador Doran simultaneously, tagged Priority 1, with a note that was unusually short for a man known for thorough documentation. 3 Veilhari military vessels have assumed a standard soft encirclement pattern around our position. This is not accidental. Recommend immediate consultation before morning session. Mira Osei read the report at 0541 and did not sleep again. She was a compact woman in her early 50s, with the particular stillness of someone who had learned to slow themselves down as a deliberate professional skill. She had commanded Perseverance for 3 years, through 2 contested space transits and a blockade standoff near the Delphi outpost that had lasted 19 days before resolution. She did not panic. But she also did not dismiss uncomfortable data in the hope that it would resolve itself. She pulled up the full sensor package, verified Tavros's calculations independently, and then did something she rarely did before a formal briefing. She called Yael Doran directly at 0603, before the ambassador had finished her first cup of coffee. "You saw the movement," Yael said. It wasn't a question. Tavros flagged it. 3 ships. Standard encirclement geometry. Osei paused. "What happened in that chamber last night?" Yael told her. "Precisely. Including the part about Vel Kareth's remark." Osei was quiet for a moment. Then, So the court sent a communication after the session, and 6 hours later, their military assets reposition. That sequence matters. I know. What do you need from me? This was one of the things Yael valued most about Mira Osei. She didn't assume her role superseded the diplomats in a diplomatic situation. She asked. Transparency, Yael said. I want them to know we see the repositioning. Not as a threat, as an acknowledgement that we're paying attention. Can you log a formal sensor contact report through the station's shared registry? Osei understood immediately. The station operated under a joint monitoring protocol. Both human and Veilhari traffic was logged in a shared system that both parties could access in real time. Filing a sensor contact report wouldn't be aggressive. It would simply make visible the fact that Perseverance had noticed the new positions. It was the diplomatic equivalent of making eye contact across a room. Done within the hour, Osei said. One more thing. Yael hesitated. Pull our contingency protocols for rapid withdrawal. Don't activate anything, just have it warm. I want us to know our options clearly before I walk into that session. After the call ended, Osei stood at the viewport in her command quarters and looked at the distant running lights of the 3 repositioned warships. They were at extreme visual range, pinprick-sized, almost indistinguishable from stars except for their slight movement. The Kashin corridor stretched beyond them, a navigational lane lined with old survey markers and contested border designations. She thought about the weight of what those 3 ships represented, not firepower exactly but intent. The decision to move them had been made by someone, in response to something. Decisions like that had chains of authorization. Vel Caratha's quiet remark. A report filed. A command given. Assets repositioned. The court had made a move. The question was whether it was a move designed to intimidate, to contain, or to accelerate. The morning session opened with the surface appearance of normalcy. Vel Carath and the 2 senior advisors took their seats. Yael and her team, herself, a legal attaché named Priya Shin, and a cultural liaison officer named Dr. Tomas Feld, took theirs. The translation matrices initialized. The procedural opening statements were exchanged. Sail Vori was not present. Her chair at the corner of the table was empty. No explanation was offered. Yael noted this without reacting to it. Her face remained professionally neutral, the careful, calibrated expression she had practiced in mirrors at the start of her career and now wore without effort. But something tightened in her chest and she recognized the feeling precisely. Concern. Not political concern. Personal concern. She filed it away. She did her job. 20 minutes into the session, Vel Carath raised the first substantive point of the day, a proposed revision to the shared transit rights framework for vessels passing through the corridor's midpoint. Reasonable on the surface. Technically workable. Yael's legal attaché was already running comparative analysis in her peripheral display. But the revision contained a clause, buried in subsection 14, in language that the translation matrix rendered as bureaucratic boilerplate, that would have given Veilhari court officials the authority to board and inspect human diplomatic vessels at will when operating within the corridor. Priya Shin caught it in real time and sent Yael a silent notification. Yael let Vel Carath finish his presentation. She waited the appropriate interval. Then she said calmly, the framework revision is a useful starting point. Before we proceed with Article 6 transit rights, I'd like to clarify the scope of subsection 14. Specifically, whether the inspection authority described there applies to all vessel classes or only commercial registered traffic. Another 4-second silence. Vel Caratha's expression did not change. Among the Veilhari, facial stillness in response to unexpected precision was the equivalent of a raised eyebrow. All vessel classes, he said. Including diplomatic vessels operating under summit protocols? The silence this time was 5 seconds. That, Vel Carath said finally, would require further review. Of course, Yael said pleasantly. We're happy to wait. That evening she sent a second report to Fleet Command. Longer than the first. She detailed the ship repositioning, the missing royal, the buried clause in the transit revision. She drew no dramatic conclusions. She outlined the pattern as she read it, a measured increase in pressure across 3 simultaneous vectors. She ended the report with a sentence that the receiving analyst at Fleet Command would later mark as the moment the situation changed classification. This is no longer a border negotiation. The court is testing our response threshold, methodically, patiently, and across multiple domains simultaneously. Recommend Fleet Command be informed that assets in the region should be aware that this situation may require more than diplomatic resolution. She did not sleep well that night. In the morning, Salvori's chair was still empty. The message arrived at 0718. It came through the standard fleet command relay, encrypted at the highest civilian diplomatic clearance, and when Yael decrypted it in the privacy of her quarters aboard Perseverance, she read it 3 times in full before she set it down. Fleet Command had received her assessment. They agreed with her classification upgrade. They were dispatching assets. The 7th Response Group. She knew the name. Everyone in Colonial Diplomatic Service knew the name, in the way that people who work in forests know the names of controlled burns. Not because they cause them, but because understanding them is part of surviving the job. The 7th Response Group was not an invasion force. It was not designed for conquest. It was a carefully structured collection of 7 vessels that existed specifically for one purpose: to change the calculus of a standoff without firing a weapon. For escort frigates. 2 resupply and carrier support vessels. 1 ship that fleet records listed simply as INS Meridian, a command and communications platform that human analysts privately referred to as the room where adults talk, because its real function was to provide a mobile, hardened diplomatic command center with enough military credibility docked to it that no one could easily dismiss what was said inside. Estimated arrival, 72 hours. Yael put the message down and stared at the wall for a while. She had asked Fleet Command to make regional assets aware. She had not asked for a deployment. But she understood why they had sent one, because the people at Fleet Command were reading the same pattern she was reading, and they had the perspective of the broader regional picture, which she did not have from inside the station. If the Veilhari Court was running a pressure campaign, the 7th's arrival would be the clearest possible signal that the pressure had been noticed at the highest levels. It would also, if misread, be the clearest possible escalation trigger. She drafted a response to Fleet Command that walked a careful line, acknowledging the deployment, requesting that the 7th hold at a position outside Veilhari sensor range until she had run one more session and could better assess the court's actual intent. She wanted 72 hours of data before 7 warships announced themselves on the border. Fleet Command replied within the hour. Deployment proceeds on schedule. 7th will hold at waypoint Callisto, 40 AU from current position, until your signal or 72-hour window expires. You have operational primacy until you signal otherwise or a threat threshold is crossed. Good luck, Ambassador. She appreciated the luck wish. She always appreciated honesty about how uncertain things were. Captain Osei assembled the Perseverance senior staff at 0900 in the tactical briefing room. Herself, Tavros, the chief engineer, the communications officer, and Yael's team. She laid out the situation without theatrics. The 7th was coming, it was holding back, they had 72 hours. Tavros updated the tactical picture. Since the overnight sensor contact report had been filed in the shared station registry, the 3 Veilhari warships had not moved. They were holding their positions at the triangle points, not advancing, not retreating, not responding. He described it as patient geometry. They know we filed the report? Yael asked. They have access to the same registry. Yes. And they haven't altered position. No. That's interesting. It was. If the repositioning had been intended to intimidate, the natural response to being noticed would be either to advance, doubling the pressure, or withdraw, suggesting the movement had been coincidental. Holding position was a third option. It said, "We know you see us. We are not hiding. We are not moving. You decide what that means." It was, Yael thought, almost a respectful form of pressure. The Veilhari were not playing dumb. They were being entirely transparent about what they were doing, while leaving the interpretation deliberately open. She had never encountered a coercive strategy this patient before. The morning session was different from the moment she walked in. Vel Kareth had brought a 4th advisor, someone she hadn't seen in the previous 11 days. He was older, with a faintly darker pigmentation that indicated high court lineage, and he carried himself with the particular economy of movement that Yael associated with people who had been dangerous for a very long time and had learned to make that quality invisible. His title, which the translation matrix rendered after a half-second delay, was Arbiter of External Consequence. She filed that phrase away carefully. The session opened with a complete withdrawal of the previous day's transit revision proposal. No explanation. Simply gone, as though it had never been on the table. The new agenda item was a cooperative survey of the corridor's middle segment, which was on the surface entirely reasonable. Both sides would benefit from better mapping. The proposal was technically well constructed. Yael spent the first 40 minutes of the session listening carefully and saying very little, which was unusual enough that Priya Shin sent her a quiet query through the team channel. She responded, listening for what they're not saying. What they were not saying was anything about Sail Vori. 2 days now without the royal daughter in the chamber. No explanation offered. No reference made. In any normal human diplomatic context, the unexplained absence of a significant figure from ongoing sessions would warrant at least a procedural acknowledgement. The Veilhari court had offered nothing. After the session, as both delegations were standing, the formal closing ritual that the Veilhari called the resonance pause, 12 seconds of shared silence before departure, Yael spoke directly. I hope the royal's absence is not due to any concern related to yesterday's informal exchange, she said. Our team would not want any member of the court to face difficulty on account of speaking with us. Velkareth turned to face her. The arbiter of external consequence was very still. The royal is engaged in other court matters, Velkareth said. Of course, Yael said. We hope she finds them satisfying. She left the chamber. In the corridor out of earshot, Tomas Feld, her cultural liaison, a man with 20 years of Veilhari academic study behind him, fell into step beside her and said quietly, the phrase you used, finds them satisfying, in Veilhari court register, that phrasing carries a secondary meaning. You essentially asked whether the royal is being treated with appropriate dignity. I know, Yael said. He was quiet for a moment. Did you intend that? Yes. Then they'll know you know their language better than we've been presenting. Yes, she said again. I think it was time for them to know that. The arbiter's report to Veilhari High Court, filed that afternoon and later recovered through intelligence channels after the situation resolved, contained a single line about the human ambassador that would be quoted in 3 different academic analyses of the first contact period. She speaks carefully, but she also speaks precisely. Treat this one as you would treat an equal. That night at 22:40, Yael received a personal message through the station's internal communication system. Not the diplomatic relay, not fleet command, not any official channel. A personal message, addressed to her by name in standard human, with spelling that was slightly too precise and pauses that were slightly too long. I am well. I am not prevented from speaking, I am being observed while speaking. This is different. I think you understand the difference. Tomorrow I will not be in the room again. The session after tomorrow I will return. Please still be there. It was unsigned. It did not need to be. Yael read it twice. Then she opened a new file, began a personal log she had not kept in 3 years, and wrote 3 sentences. The court is running 2 simultaneous strategies. One involves ships and leverage. The other involves a young royal who learned standard human on her own and is asking a human ambassador not to leave. I don't think those 2 strategies were designed to interact. She closed the log. She opened the cultural briefing files again. 72 hours until the 7th response group reached Waypoint Callisto. She had work to do. On the 14th day of the summit, the arbiter of external consequence spoke for the first time in a formal session. His name, rendered through the translation matrix, was something close to Vareth Solen. He had been sitting in the corner of the chamber for 2 sessions, watching, not participating, with the patience of a man who had decided long ago that timing was the only real skill in negotiation. Yael had been watching him watch her. She had been waiting. He began not with the corridor. Not with transit rights or survey protocols, or any of the technical machinery that had occupied the previous 13 days. He began with a question. Ambassador Doran, he said, and the translation matrix rendered his Veilhari with unusual smoothness, which meant either that his dialect was exceptionally clear or that he had calibrated his speech for easy translation. How long does a human live? Yael paused. In good conditions, 100 to 120 years. Biological baseline. And how long has humanity been spacefaring? Approximately 400 years, counting from first sustained orbital habitat. For human generations, he said. Roughly, yes. He let that settle. Then, the Veilhari have been spacefaring for 8,000 years. We have seen civilizations complete their entire arc from first contact to extinction within the span of a single court generation. We have watched empires build themselves, expand beyond their carrying capacity, and collapse into the very space lanes they created. He paused. Not for effect, the Veilhari didn't perform pauses. He paused because what he was about to say required the clarity of silence before it. We are not hostile to humanity, he said. We are concerned about the rate. Yael had been briefed on this theory. She had read analyses, position papers, intelligence assessments. But hearing it stated directly in a formal session, by a man with the title of arbiter of external consequence, carried a weight that no briefing document had prepared her for. The Veilhari were not afraid of humanity's power. They were afraid of humanity's speed. In 400 years, humans had gone from sustained orbital presence to over 200 settled colony worlds, 3 independent stations, and a fleet that, while not technically militarized in peacetime, maintained enough force projection capability to defend every settlement simultaneously. They had done this not through unified central planning but through the chaotic, compounding momentum of decentralized expansion. Millions of individual decisions, made by millions of people, all pushing in roughly the same direction. From the outside, from a civilization 8,000 years old that had watched the pattern before, it looked exactly like the early phase of every expansion arc that had ever ended badly. "You want us to slow down," Yael said. "We want you to demonstrate that you can slow down," Vareth Solen said. "That is a different request." She understood the distinction immediately. He wasn't asking humanity to stop expanding. He was asking for evidence that humanity possessed the institutional capacity for restraint, that the momentum was chosen rather than compelled, that there were breaks. "The Kashin corridor," she said slowly. "The negotiations. The transit rights framework." "A test," he confirmed. "Of a specific kind. We wanted to see how your delegation responded under layered pressure. The ship repositioning, the clause, the absent royal." He paused again. "You responded precisely." Priya Shin, beside Yael, was very still in the particular way of someone processing a rapid recalibration. "This entire summit," Priya said carefully, "has been an assessment. The border dispute is real," Vareth Solen said. "The corridor rights are genuinely contested. But we have been watching how you navigate the space between the stated problem and the unstated pressure. That navigation is more informative than any treaty language." It was, Yael thought later, an elegant piece of diplomatic design. Complain about one thing, watch how the other side handles the complaint plus the surrounding pressure. What you learned about their decision-making architecture was worth more than any formal declaration. She did not say this out loud. She said, "And what did you learn?" "That your ambassador is careful," he said. "That your captain filed a sensor contact report rather than going silent, which indicated transparency preference over tactical advantage. That your fleet command deployed assets but held them at distance rather than advancing, which indicated institutional confidence rather than institutional anxiety." He looked at her directly, the Veilhari equivalent of a very specific acknowledgement. "And that when given the choice between accepting a framing that disadvantaged you or reframing diplomatically, your ambassador reframed." "You were testing our reflexes," Yael said. "We were reading your character," he said. "Reflexes are character at sufficient resolution." The chamber was quiet. "What happens now?" Yael asked. "Now," Vareth Solen said, "we have an actual conversation." It lasted 4 hours. No procedural breaks, no translation delays, no formal agenda. The court advisors contributed occasionally but mostly listened. Vareth Solen spoke directly and Yael responded directly, and somewhere in the second hour the session stopped being a negotiation and became something closer to a genuine exchange between people trying to honestly describe their actual concerns. The Veilhari were worried about resource pressure. Their outer territories were adjacent to humanity's expansion vectors, and the speed of human settlement had already produced 2 incidents of contested claim in the previous decade. Both resolved but both unpleasant, and both pointing toward a trend line that extended, in Veilhari institutional thinking, across centuries rather than years. Humanity, Yael explained as honestly as she could, was not expanding from unified ambition. Individual settlements made individual decisions. The expansion looked organized from the outside because it was responding to the same set of pressures: available space, resource necessity, the compounding effect of population growth, but it had no central direction. There was no one you could call and ask them to stop. "That," Vareth Solen said, "is precisely the problem." "I understand that," Yael said. "But it's also the reality. The question is whether we can build mechanisms that address your concerns given that reality, rather than trying to solve the problem by changing what we actually are." He was quiet for a long time. "What mechanisms," he said, "do you think would be credible?" They were still in the chamber at 1900 when Sail Vori appeared. She came in through the side entrance, not the main doors, the smaller one on the left that Yael had assumed was a service access point. She was carrying a tablet, which was unusual, and she was moving with the focused energy of someone who had somewhere to be and had calculated exactly how long they had to be there. She crossed directly to where Yael was seated, placed the tablet on the table and said, in standard human, without a glance at the translation matrix, "I have been reading your public legislative record. Your colonial governance frameworks. Specifically the Outer Settlements Compact of 2387. Yael blinked. That's a fairly obscure document. It establishes a precedent for voluntary expansion moratoriums in contested zones, Sailvori said. It was used twice, in the Kareth Outpost dispute and in the Delphi Station boundary case. It is enforceable through your own internal legal structures without requiring a formal interspecies treaty. She straightened and looked at Vareth Solen for just a moment. Something passed between them that Yael couldn't quite read, and then she said, I have been thinking about your question. About what mechanisms would be credible. I thought this was relevant. Then she left. The room was very quiet. Vareth Solen looked at the tablet. Then at Yael. She did this on her own, he said. It was not a question, but it also wasn't quite a statement. She tends to, Yael said. Something shifted in the arbiter's expression. Very slightly, very briefly. If she had been less experienced, she would have missed it. But she had spent 14 years watching faces across high-stakes tables, and she recognized it. Pride. At 0347 on the 16th day of the summit, the 7th response group dropped out of transit at waypoint Callisto, 40 astronomical units from the station. Commander Tavros logged the arrival at 0349 and sent Yael a notification with a single line of context. They're holding. All 7. Engines at minimal output. No active targeting systems. She read it before dawn and replied, Good. Log it in the shared registry. He did. At 0612, the Veilhari sensor network, which both parties understood was fully capable of reading human vessel positions at that range, registered the 7TH's arrival and reported it to Veilhari High Command. Yael knew this because Vareth Solen mentioned it at the opening of the morning session. Your fleet has arrived at the outer waypoint, he said. Not accusatorially, observationally. Yes, Yael said. Precautionary deployment. Standard protocol when diplomatic assets are operating in a contested zone under elevated tension. They are not advancing. No. He considered this. The decision to hold them there, that was yours? I requested it. Fleet Command agreed. You have that authority? To hold a fleet group? I have operational primacy during active diplomatic sessions, under the terms of the summit charter both our governments signed. She paused. I also had to ask politely. Fleet Command makes its own decisions. The Veilhari concept of distributed authority, the idea that a military deployment could be held at the request of a single diplomat, without that diplomat having formal command rank, was, she knew, genuinely difficult for the court structure to process. Veilhari command hierarchies were vertical and clear. Orders moved in one direction. The idea that Perseverance's captain would defer to an ambassador who would in turn negotiate with a fleet group about its positioning was structurally foreign. You asked your military to wait, Vareth Solen said slowly, and they waited. Yes. Another of those long silences. Then, unexpectedly, that is the most reassuring thing I have learned about humanity in the course of this summit. 3,000 kilometers from the station, aboard VHS Thrain, the escort carrier at the northern point of the Veilhari Triangle, a conversation was occurring that Yael would not learn about for 2 years, when it appeared in a Veilhari historical account of the negotiation period. The Thrain's commanding officer, a senior Veilhari fleet captain named Marin Vel, had been watching the 7th Response Group's arrival through his long-range sensors with the focused attention of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at. 7 human vessels. Arranged in a standard protective formation. Engines minimal. No weapon signatures. Positioned at a distance that was simultaneously close enough to signal intent and far enough to leave room for de-escalation. He had contacted his direct superior in the Veilhari fleet command chain and delivered an assessment that was, by Veilhari military standards, unusually subjective. They are not here to fight. They are here so that we know they could fight if required. There is a difference. The fleet group is a diplomatic instrument, not a military one. The humans understand the difference and they expect us to understand it too. I recommend we respond accordingly. His superior had forwarded the assessment upward. It reached Veilhari High Command 14 minutes after Vareth Solen mentioned the fleet's arrival in the session chamber. The repositioning came at 11:40. Not the Veilhari Triangle, that remained unchanged, those 3 ships holding their patient geometry with the same disciplined stillness they'd maintained for days. The new movement was different. A 4th Veilhari vessel, a designation in human fleet records as a diplomatic courier, fast and lightly armed, accelerated from the station's outer dock and began a transit toward the Kashin corridor's midpoint. Tavros flagged it immediately. Then he flagged it again when he realized what the courier's heading actually represented. It was moving toward a position equidistant between the Thrain's location and the human 7th Response Group's position at Callisto Point. Midway between the two fleets. They're establishing a neutral marker, Osei said when Tavros briefed her. It's a visual statement. We're not advancing on you, you're not advancing on us, and there's a visible midpoint. It's a de-escalation gesture, Tavros said. Showing their high command is watching and approves of the held position. Osei sent Yael a message. Veilhari diplomatic courier just took up position at the corridor midpoint. Your read. Yael was in session when the message came through. She read it, processed it, and thought for a moment about the architecture of the gesture, the precision with which it was timed, the fact that it was a diplomatic courier and not a military asset, the location at the visual midpoint. She typed back, it's an acknowledgement. They're telling their own fleet the human position at Callisto is acceptable. Keep the 7th where it is. Then she looked up and caught Vareth Solen watching her. He had seen the message come through. He couldn't have read it, but he had seen her read it, process it, and decide. He gave the very slightest inclination of his head. She returned it. That afternoon, Sail Vori returned to the chamber. She arrived through the main doors this time formally, and took her corner seat with the composed bearing of someone who had been told exactly where to sit and how to sit there. She was wearing what Tomas Feld later described as court formal register attire. A distinction that indicated she was there in an official capacity, which she had never been before. Vel Kareth opened the afternoon session with a procedural change that caught Yael completely off guard. The court wishes to formally introduce Sail Vori as an observer with speaking rights for the remainder of the summit, he said. This is a designation of the inquirer's role, under Protocol 41 of the Veilhari External Engagement Charter. Tomas Feld made a very small sound beside Yael that she interpreted correctly as that is historically unprecedented, and I will explain later. Yael said, the human delegation welcomes this designation and looks forward to any contributions the royal may wish to offer. Sail Vori met her eyes across the table. There was something in that look, not triumph, not relief, although both were there, but something steadier underneath it. The look of someone who had made an argument in the right rooms with the right evidence and won, not because they were powerful but because they had been correct. Yael recognized it. She had worn that expression herself a few times in her career. The session that followed was, by the formal records account, primarily focused on the technical parameters of the proposed survey cooperation framework. Boring, important work, the kind that doesn't make good news but prevents bad history. But what Yael remembered of it, in every subsequent retelling, was a moment at the very end. Vareth Solen was summarizing the day's agreements, careful, precise, nothing finalized yet but the shape of something credible emerging, when Sail Vori raised her hand. Which was apparently not a standard Veilhari gesture, but Vareth Solen recognized where she had learned it and allowed it. I have a question, she said. In standard human, which she then translated herself into Veilhari, slowly, carefully but correctly. The Outer Settlements Compact Moratorium Mechanism, she said. Would humanity invoke it voluntarily? Without being required to by treaty? The question landed in the center of the room. It was asking something that no formal diplomatic session had asked directly, whether humans would choose restraint when restraint wasn't compelled. Whether the breaks were real or theoretical. Yael looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Vareth Solen. I can't answer that without authorization from my government, she said honestly. But I can tell you that a voluntary moratorium in specifically contested zones, under a jointly monitored framework, is something I would recommend pursuing. And I believe the political will exists. On what basis? Vareth Solen asked. On the basis, Yael said, that we held our fleet group at Callisto Point when we didn't have to. Restraint has to start somewhere. We started it this morning. The room was quiet. The arbiter of external consequence looked at the human ambassador for a long time. Then he wrote something in the session record, by hand, on a physical medium, in the old Veilhari court script that indicated formal binding intent. He turned the record toward her without explanation. The translation matrix rendered it, after a half-second delay. This summit will continue until an agreement worthy of the effort is reached. The opposition appeared on the 17th day, and it came from inside the Veilhari court. Yael had expected it. Any sufficiently complex institution contains multiple factions, and a negotiation that was going better than expected would alarm the people who had arranged their positions around the expectation of failure. She had built this assumption into her reading of the situation from the beginning. She simply hadn't known which face it would wear. It wore the face of a Veilhari Council representative named Keth Morvain, whose title translated as sovereign rights advocate and whose role in the court structure, as Tomas Feld had explained, was to ensure that no agreement made with an external party diminished Veilhari autonomy or prestige. In theory, this was a legitimate and necessary function, a check against diplomatic overreach. In practice, it was the position most often occupied by people who had built their influence on the expectation of maintained separation. He arrived in the chamber unannounced at the start of the morning session on day 17, took a seat beside Vel Kareth, and placed 3 documents on the table before a single procedural word had been spoken. "These are formal objections," he said, "filed under the Veilhari sovereign review process. They require acknowledgement and response before this summit can proceed." Vareth Solen looked at the documents for a long moment. His expression was unreadable. He did not look at Vel Kareth, which told Yael something. Yael looked at the documents. The translation matrix was rendering them as fast as she could read. The first objection, the proposed moratorium framework, represented a concession of Veilhari enforcement rights within sovereign adjacent space, which required high court ratification rather than summit-level agreement. The second objection, Sail Vori's designation as inquirer, had been granted without full court protocol, and any contributions she had made to the negotiation were, under strict interpretation, outside the formal record. The third objection, the presence of a human military fleet group at Waypoint Callisto, constituted a material change in the negotiating context that invalidated all agreements reached after its arrival. They were careful objections. None of them were absurd. Each one had a legitimate procedural hook. But together, their effect was to unwind the previous 3 days of genuine progress by challenging the validity of the process that had produced it. Yael read all 3 documents in approximately 4 minutes. Then she looked up, and she looked specifically at Vareth Solen, because the critical question was not whether Keth Morvain's objections had merit but whether the arbiter had the institutional standing and the will to address them. He was already speaking. "The first objection will be reviewed," he said, with the measured precision of someone choosing every syllable carefully. "However, the moratorium framework as currently drafted is a statement of intent, not a binding enforcement instrument. It requires no high court ratification at this stage. The review, when it occurs, will be of the finalized text." He paused. "The second objection is noted for the record. The inquirer designation was granted under the arbiter's discretionary authority, which is established under Protocol 41. This is a procedural dispute that can be addressed through standard review without affecting the current session." Another pause, longer this time. "The third objection," he said, "I am declining to accept." Keth Morvain's stillness, which had been the composed stillness of a person confident in their position, shifted slightly. "The presence of the human fleet group at Callisto Point," Vareth Solen said, "was noted and assessed by this court on the 16th day. It was determined at that time to be a defensive deployment held voluntarily at the request of the human ambassador. That assessment is in the session record. To now accept an objection that recharacterizes the fleet's presence retroactively would be inconsistent with the court's own prior determination." He set down the 3 documents. "The summit continues," he said. Keth Morvain did not leave. He sat through the morning session in the rigid stillness of a man who had made a move and watched it fail, recalculating in real time. Yael kept her attention on the session and off of him, because giving his frustration the dignity of her notice would serve no one. But she was aware of him. The way you are aware of a structural element in a building that has started to carry more load than it was designed for. During the procedural break at mid-morning, he left the chamber briefly. Tomas Feld, who had an experienced intelligence officer's habit of noting when people moved, tracked the direction of his departure and sent Yael a quiet message. He went toward the communications center. Yael replied, "Log it." She did not know at that moment what Keth Morvain was communicating or to whom. She knew only that a faction that felt threatened by this summit's success would not make a single move and then stop. They would escalate to whatever level of the court structure would hear them. The question was how high that went and how quickly. The answer came 5 hours later. At 1743, Commander Tavros contacted Yael from Perseverance's tactical station with a tone in his voice she had come to associate with unwelcome precision. He had identified 2 additional Veilhari warships that had begun transit toward the station's sector. Not the 3 that had been holding at the triangle points, new vessels from a different departure vector, moving at a velocity that suggested urgency rather than deployment. Origin point? Yael asked. Inner Veilhari territory. Closer to the capital systems. He paused. These aren't regional patrol assets. They're fleet response vessels. Osei joined the call. Someone with authority over more than local assets just issued a movement order. Yael thought for a moment. How long until they arrive? Approximately 31 hours. What's the 7th doing? Holding at Callisto. Tavros checked. They've picked up the new signatures. No response yet. She made a decision quickly. Get me a line to Meridian, she said, naming the 7th's command platform. I need to speak to whoever is in command before they decide anything based on what they're seeing. The commanding officer of INS Meridian was Rear Admiral Sasha Petrov, a spare, gray-haired woman who had spent her career in contested space operations and had a reputation for answering difficult calls with inconvenient clarity. She came on the line within 3 minutes, which told Yael she had been waiting. You've seen the new movement, Yael said. Yes, Admiral Petrov said. 2 fleet response vessels. My analyst thinks someone escalated to high command level. That's my read too. I believe there's a faction within the Veilhari court that is trying to use the fleet movement to destabilize the summit. I don't think the Arbiter authorized it. Petrov was quiet for a moment. That's a specific conclusion. It's a working hypothesis. Yael paused. What I need is for the 7th to continue holding position, and to do it visibly, I need the Veilhari at every level of their structure to see that the human fleet's response to an escalation is to hold still. You're asking me to sit on my hands while 2 unknown fleet assets close toward our position. I'm asking you to make the most confident possible statement about our intentions by not reacting to a provocation. The silence on the line lasted long enough that Yael began composing alternative arguments. Then Petrov said, You have 8 hours. If those ships come within 20 AU without a clear indication from the Veilhari side that the escalation has been addressed, I'm moving the 7th to an intercept-ready position. Not aggressive, but visible. 8 hours, Yael agreed. Thank you, Admiral. She returned to the station and went directly to Vareth Solen. Not through channels, not through a formal session request, not through the procedural machinery that governed every official interaction. She walked to the Veilhari diplomatic quarters in the station's inner ring, identified herself to the security detail, and asked to speak with the Arbiter directly. He came to the door, which was itself unusual. He looked at her with the expression she had come to associate with his moments of genuine attention, a kind of focused stillness. The ships from the inner systems, she said. Are they yours? He was quiet for one breath. Then, no. High Command. A specific faction within High Command, he said carefully. This was not an authorized response to our summit status. Can you stop them? Another pause. Longer. That requires a communication I was hoping not to make for another day. You have 8 hours, she said. After that, my fleet moves to intercept ready. Your fleet would not fire. No, she said. But if your unauthorized faction and my fleet end up in close proximity in a charged situation, the space for error shrinks considerably. I would rather not have this summit fail because of a miscalculation by people who want it to fail. He looked at her for a long moment. Ambassador, he said in careful standard human, his first use of the language directly in all 17 days, you are more trouble than the fleet report suggested. She recognized the phrase. She had suspected he had access to the Arbiter's assessment. I've heard that before, she said. The 2 ships from the inner system stopped their approach at 0214 on the 18th day. Tavros logged the deceleration at 0217 and sent Yael 3 words. They're holding position. She read the message in the dark of her quarters, set down her tablet, and allowed herself precisely 30 seconds of relief before she began thinking about what came next. Vareth Solen had made his call. Whatever conversation had occurred at the high command level, she would never know the full shape of it, had produced a halt. Keth Morvain's faction had been overridden. The 2 fleet response vessels were now sitting at a distance that was close enough to demonstrate that they existed and far enough to demonstrate that they had been told to stop. It was not a complete victory for the summit's continuation. It was something more fragile and more real. The internal negotiation within the Veilhari power structure had reached a temporary equilibrium, and that equilibrium had just barely come down on the side of the people in the room. She got up, made coffee in the small galley of her quarters, and spent an hour writing notes that she would never include in any formal report. Observations about the nature of the past 18 days. The architecture of the pressure campaign. The way Sailvori's presence had functioned as something the formal analysis would never quite capture. A genuine human element, introduced into a process that had been designed to remain purely institutional, and the way that human element had changed the calibration of everything around it. She wrote, the court was testing whether we had brakes. But I think Sailvori was asking a different question. She was asking whether we were worth knowing. Whether the people inside the institutional machinery were recognizable as people. Both questions needed answering. We answered both. The final session opened at 0900 on the 18th day. Keth Morvain was not present. Vel Kareth was there, and the two senior advisors and Verith Solen, and in the corner seat that had become familiar in the past few days, Sailvori, in court formal register attire, with the composed bearing of the inquirer. Admiral Petrov had signaled at 0745 that she was extending the 7th's hold at Callisto indefinitely, pending summit resolution. The three Veilhari vessels at the triangle points had, sometime during the early morning, quietly returned to standard patrol spacing. The diplomatic courier at the corridor midpoint remained. The chamber felt different. Not relaxed. The Veilhari did not do relaxed as a cultural matter, but settled. The particular quality of a room where the people inside it have decided to stop testing the room and start using it. Verith Solen opened with a statement that was not on the prepared agenda. The Veilhari High Court wishes to acknowledge that the conduct of the human delegation throughout this summit has been consistent with the standards required for genuine engagement. This acknowledgement is being entered into the formal record. Yael said, the human delegation is grateful for the acknowledgement, and wishes to offer a reciprocal statement, that the Veilhari Court's approach to this summit demonstrated an institutional seriousness that we believe represents the foundation necessary for durable agreement. Formality exchanged. Dignity established. Foundation confirmed. Then they went to work. What they agreed to, after 4 hours of careful drafting and 3 hours of legal review and one significant rewrite of subsection 9 that Priya Shen handled with the focused intensity of a surgeon, was not a treaty. It was not a peace accord. It was not a declaration. It was a framework for managed coexistence in contested adjacent space, a document that both sides explicitly described as preliminary, limited in scope, and subject to revision. It contained 7 primary articles and 14 subsections, and it was approximately 43 pages in human legal format. Article 1 established a jointly monitored buffer zone along the Kashin corridor, with clear survey rights for both parties and a shared notification protocol for any new settlement activity within 15 light-years of the zone boundary. Article 2 established the moratorium mechanism, voluntary, jurisdiction-specific, renewable in 5-year increments, that Sailvori had found in the Outer Settlements Compact. Under this mechanism, human colonial expansion in specifically designated contested zones could be paused by mutual agreement, monitored by a joint oversight body, and reviewed regularly. It required no permanent restriction on human settlement. It required demonstrated capacity for restraint when restraint was warranted. Article 3 created a formal diplomatic channel between the Veilhari High Court and the Human Colonial Administration, a permanent, staff channel, not a summit-dependent process, with clear escalation procedures. Articles 4 through 6 addressed the technical matter of transit rights through the corridor, the survey cooperation framework, and the joint resource mapping protocol. Necessary, important, unglamorous. Article 7 was Sailvori's article. Officially titled the Cultural Exchange and Inquiry Protocol, it established a formal mechanism for extended information exchange between human and Veilhari representatives, including the option for junior representatives from either party to spend up to 6 months at the other's facilities in an inquirer capacity. It had a budget allocation, a governing oversight structure, and a renewable mandate. It was, in the dry language of diplomatic documentation, an exchange program. Sailvori had drafted the core text herself, in standard human, over the 2 days she had been absent from the chamber. Tomas Feld had told Yael later that when he reviewed the legal language, he had found it structurally sound and only needed minor formatting corrections. She had taught herself the treaty drafting conventions from publicly available sources. The signing ceremony, if it could be called that, was brief. Verith Solen signed for the Veilhari High Court. Yael signed for the Human Diplomatic Mission, with the understanding that the document would require formal ratification by the Colonial Administration Council before coming into full effect, a process she was reasonably confident would succeed, because she had spoken to the Council's chair twice during the summit and had a clear read on the political landscape. When both signatures were on the document, there was a moment of silence, not the engineered, weaponized silence of the Veilhari Court, but something quieter than that. The silence of people in a room who have accomplished something difficult and are allowing themselves to be briefly still in the presence of it. Sailvori broke it. "I have a question," she said. It was the same opening she had used before, in the same standard human, with the same precise consonants. The room responded the way it always did to her now, with attention rather than tension. The exchange program, she said. The 6-month inquirer placement. Is there a specific application process, or is it handled through the diplomatic channel? Yael looked at her. Then she looked at Vareth Solen, who was looking at Sail Vori with the expression of a man who had known this question was coming and had decided, at some point in the past few days, to stop preventing it. Diplomatic channel, Yael said. I believe the first applications could be submitted as soon as the ratification process is complete. How long is the ratification process? 6 to 8 months, Yael said. Assuming no significant opposition. Sail Vori nodded slowly. The calculation was visible on her face, not the calculation of a politician or a strategist, but the simple arithmetic of a young person working out how long they would have to wait for something they had decided they wanted. I will begin preparing my application, she said. Captain Osei was on the Bridge of Perseverance when the summit's conclusion was transmitted to Fleet Command. She watched the notification arrive, confirmed receipt, and sent a brief message to Admiral Petrov at Callisto Point. Summit concluded successfully. Framework signed. Ambassador requests the 7th stand down to standard patrol at its discretion. Petrov's reply came back in 4 minutes. Understood. Good work. Tell your ambassador we'll be at Callisto for another 12 hours, then returning to standard station. In case anyone's watching. Osei smiled. Someone was always watching. That was the point. She looked out at the stars, at the distant pinpricks that were the Veilhari Triangle ships now dispersing back to their patrol routes, at the barely visible marker light of the diplomatic courier at the corridor midpoint, at the 40 AU distance where 7 human vessels were completing their non-aggressive, non-advancing, emphatically visible deployment. This, she thought, was what people who didn't do this work sometimes missed when they looked at military deployments and diplomatic frameworks and signed documents. They saw the formal product and missed the enormous weight of everything that had been chosen rather than done. The fleet that held still. The clause that wasn't accepted. The protocol that was cited precisely. The question about rain on a world 14 light-years away that had, somehow, become the foundation for the beginning of something. None of it was inevitable. All of it had been decided. Yael's final personal log entry from the summit, written at 21:40 on the 18th day, was characteristically short. We did not solve anything permanent today. The corridor will require monitoring for decades. The moratorium mechanism will be tested and renegotiated and argued over in rooms I will never sit in. The factions that don't want this to work are still inside the Veilhari court structure, and they will find other moments. But we built something credible. Something that started honestly and held together under pressure. That's not nothing. Sail Vori asked me what rain felt like. I told her. That was the first honest exchange in this entire process, and I think, in retrospect, it might have been the most important one. She'll be on Earth in 8 months if everything processes correctly. I've already written a note to the Colonial Administration Cultural Desk asking them to make sure she gets assigned somewhere that gets proper rain. In the fleet records, in the diplomatic archives, in the academic analyses that would be written over the following decades about the first Kashan Summit, the document would be described in the careful neutral language of institutional history, a preliminary framework, limited in scope, significant in precedent. The historians would note the ship movements, the pressure tactics, the faction dynamics, the careful procedural maneuvers. They would analyze the moratorium mechanism and the exchange protocol and the Article 3 diplomatic channel. They would not note the 6 minutes Yael sat in the corridor before she was steady enough to walk. They would not note the personal message in halting standard human sent through an informal channel at 2240 on day 11. They would not note the precise moment when an arbiter of external consequence, watching a human ambassador make a decision based on information she had just received in real time, gave the very slightest inclination of his head. History noted the formal record. The rest of it, the weight of a hand on a wrist, the question about rain, the fleet that chose to stay still, that lived in other places. It was enough.